live on different social media channels. Dr. Muasher is the former Deputy Prime Minister, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Jordan, and is now the Vice President of Studies, as I mentioned, at Carnegie. Today, we're going to have a far-reaching conversation about the Arab region. And I can only start with the question of Palestine, which you have worked on extensively, including the Arab Peace Plan in 2002, but also far longer. If I'm not mistaken, you were also part of the Madrid peace negotiations. So after President Biden's visit to the Middle East in the summer, you wrote, "The greatest casualty from President Biden's recent visit to the Middle East was peace between Palestinians and Israelis." Can you tell us why you said that, and where will the prospects for peace be in 2023?
When President Biden assumed his duties, there was a lot of hope, at least in this region, that he would not just reverse President Trump's policies, particularly with regard to the deal of the century, but that he would somehow give the peace process more serious attention. What has happened since then is, yes, President Biden stopped the deal of the century, but sufficed at that. He did not start a new peace process. He limited his interest in the Middle East to a nuclear deal with Iran and to supporting the Abrahamic Accords, which, as we know, have little, if anything, to do with peace. The declared position of the US administration today is that they want to maintain a long-term truce until such a time when conditions for a two-state solution become possible again. My view, and I think this is the mainstream view now of most Middle East experts, is that if conditions are not ripe now for a two-state solution, they are not going to be ever ripe for a two-state solution. The number of settlers in the West Bank and Gaza, and West Bank and Jerusalem, stands today at more than 700,000, almost 25% of the population of the West Bank. There is, I think it's almost impossible to separate the two communities, which is the basis for a two-state solution. When President Biden came to the region, he did not talk about that at all. He did not give the issue of human rights, which are being violated on a daily basis, any attention. And I often joke that the situation today is akin to two people arguing over a slice of pizza while one of them is eating it. That is not going to result in a peace agreement.
Following from this, let me ask you, I mean, today, Israel's former prime minister and who has been officially tasked with forming a new government, and it's widely obviously expected to be quite right-wing, more right-wing than anything we've seen in Israel in recent history. So what consequences will the formation of a Netanyahu government have on Israeli-Palestinian relations and on Palestinians living in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, but also on Palestinian refugees around the region?
The Israeli political scene has moved to the right dramatically over the last 30 years. But what we are witnessing today is not just a right-wing government. What we are witnessing today is a racist government. You have members of the government is not formed yet, but the incoming members of the Israeli government are people who were declared illegal by the Israeli government itself, by the American administration itself. These are people who are calling not just for the expulsion of Palestinians in the West Bank. They are calling for the expulsion of Palestinians inside Israel, who are today Israeli citizens. And so we are dealing with no less than a racist government. We have argued at Carnegie for some time now that a two-state solution is no longer possible, and that the focus of the conflict is shifting from that where people argue over the shape of a solution to what should be a rights-based approach. In other words, no matter what the shape of the solution is, whether it is two states, one state, or whatever, any solution from now on that is not rights-based, meaning that does not respect the rights of all, Palestinians as well as Israelis, if we don't have such a rights-based solution, any prospects for a peaceful agreement is illusional. What we are witnessing from the Israeli government today is not just a stop to a peace process, which anyway has not been active for quite some time now. But what we are witnessing today and what the international community will have to deal with is not to keep calling for negotiations that are not going to come. What we are witnessing today is that the international community will increasingly have to deal with a state that employs two separate legal systems, not just inside the occupied territories, but inside its own borders. And that is, frankly, the legal definition of apartheid.
Staying on a parallel topic, the Abraham Accords and regional alliances. We're now more than 2 years into the Abraham Accords, which were ratified in September 2020. Proponents of the Abraham Accord argue that these agreements have substantially increased the region's options for countering Iranian threats. But just as a note, there's quite a lot of local resistance, as we're seeing from various polls that have been conducted to the accords across the MENA region, to the US-backed Abraham Accords, and the broader peace deal with Israel, not least of which is the Arab Barometer, but there was also something by the Washington Institute. I mean, there are a number of polls that indicate this broad resistance. So in your view, in what ways have these agreements changed the Middle East? I mean, are in the conditions that allowed the Abraham Accords to take place, are they still in place today?
It's interesting now that we are in the middle of the World Cup games. It's interesting to see that the games are being conducted in a Gulf state, and it's interesting to see how the audience is supporting Palestine and raising Palestinian flags. And not just an audience from Qatar, but from all across Gulf states. It's a clear indication that there is popular resistance to normalization with Israel that stops short of arriving at a peace agreement there. These countries, when they signed, if we remember, agreements with Israel, did so under the Trump administration for reasons that had nothing to do with peace. Sudan wanted to get off the terrorism list. The United Arab Emirates wanted to get F-35 planes from the United States. Morocco wanted recognition of its claimed sovereignty over the Western Sahara, etc. But in order for these countries to market these agreements to their own public, they were marketed as agreements that will help the peace process and that will help moderate the Israeli view on the peace process. Well, the record suggests, of course, otherwise. Since the agreements were signed, as you said, 3 years ago, the Israeli position has hardened, and we are on the verge of seeing the most right-wing racist government in Israel's history. What is problematic, in my view, about these agreements is that it is giving Israel the false impression that it does not need an agreement with the Palestinians in order to be accepted in the region. That by jumping over the Palestinians and signing agreements with the rest of the Arab world, that somehow they can be accepted in the region. Well, of course, it's not the Moroccans who are living amongst Israelis. It's not the Sudanese. It's not the Gulf members. It's the Palestinians. And unless you come to an agreement with the Palestinians, no agreement with the Arab world can work as a substitute for an agreement with the Palestinians. Egypt and Jordan have signed peace agreements. Egypt, it's been almost 50 years now. Jordan, about 30 years. And yet, that has not contributed to a sustainable and permanent peace in the region, because the central issue, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, has not been solved yet.
Moving to, couldn't agree with you more, but moving to another topic, which is the war in Ukraine and its impact or its reverberations in the region. We've seen Arab countries really, literally not responding to the Ukraine war in the same way that much of the Western world has. In fact, it seems that many Arabs view, not just at the level of governments, but also at the level of ordinary citizens, while they express sympathy and empathy with the victims of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they also view the reaction of the Western world to the Ukraine conflict as hypocritical to some extent. Just as an example, the Israelis occupied the Golan Heights in 1967, annexed it in 1981, and the United States has now recognized this annexation, whereas it has denounced Russia's annexation of parts of Ukraine as illegal. So why is the Ukraine war not more of a priority for the region beyond the issue of double standards? And pegging onto this, what do you think drove the US recognition of the Golan Heights despite its stance on the illegal annexation of lands or unilateral?
You would think that the logical position that the Arab world should take on the Russian-Ukraine war is, categorical support of the Ukraine. Why? Because, we have the same situation of Israel-Palestine. We have a country that is occupied by another country. And you would think that the position should be total support for Ukraine. We have not seen that. There is sometimes nominal support, but there is not that unequivocal support for the Ukrainians. Why? In my view, two reasons. One, we have an anti-US sentiment in the region, which is widespread, because of course, US policy on Palestine and because of the invasion on Iraq. And that has led people to support anyone who is against the US, regardless of the strength of the legal argument. Because the legal argument is clear. Arabs should not support any acquisition of territory by force. That is the basis of 242. But the anti-US support has, I think, contributed largely to this popular position in the Arab world. There is another reason as well. The US, whether we like it or not, has recalibrated its interests and position in the region. Some people will call it a withdrawal from the region. Others would say reduced interest. But the record is clear, whether in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or the peace process, the level of interest by the United States in the region has been reduced. And there has been a pivoting, if you will, to other areas of the world that are today more important to the US. China and Russia, of course, are two cases in point. That vacuum that the US left in the region has been utilized by many countries, on top of which are Russia, China, Iran, Turkey. The Russians are very involved in the region, whether in, for example, providing food supplies, wheat to countries like Egypt, like Tunisia, and others, whether it is military aid to countries like Egypt again. And it is an irony today to see that even in the Gulf, that had unequivocal support for the United States in the past. Today, the Saudis are, or as we speak, receiving the Chinese president in a very unprecedented way. China and Russia, in particular, have been able to penetrate the region largely because the U.S. has stopped looking at the region as, as the same strategic priority that it once held.
On this note and this increasing cooperation, we've also seen mainly oil-producing countries have a windfall from the increase in oil and energy prices as a result, partly as a result of the Ukraine conflict. Do you think that this, do you think this financial windfall will allow these nations perhaps to turn the clock back on economic reform, or are we looking at a different, we seem to be looking at a different modus operandi moving forward? What do you make of it?
Well, we need to, remind ourselves that this region has had three major crises in the last decade, starting with the Arab uprisings, moving on to the decline in oil prices in 2014, and then the, COVID, and then the Russia-Ukraine war. All of these crises have deepened, not started, but deepened an already bad economic and political situation. In the past, oil importing countries used to rely either on the largesse of Gulf countries providing them aid, mainly to support their budget expenditure, and on their security services to basically maintain social peace. It's the carrot and the stick approach. These two tools, after 2011 and 2014, have been largely weakened. When COVID-19 came about, coupled with the Russia-Ukraine war, it deepened an already very, very acute economic situation. Oil importing countries today find themselves in a position where, youth unemployment is almost 30% across the Arab world. It is not a sustainable position. And yet most Arab countries are refusing to abandon these old tools which are no longer sufficient to maintain social peace and to move to more inclusive decision-making, diversification of their dependence on oil, equal citizenship, all the new tools that are today becoming a must to maintain social peace. Now, we have seen with oil-producing countries, we have seen the start of some economic measures that were brought about almost by force because of the decline in oil prices in 2014. And so Gulf countries started some economic reform measures, introducing income tax measures, removing subsidies, etc. Now they are witnessing a windfall profit of about $1.3 trillion, the IMF estimates, over the next 4 years. Are they going to go back to business as usual because of this windfall profit? Or are they going to keep doing the right thing? And frankly, the right thing cannot be limited to economic reform. It also has to introduce political and social reform in these countries. Frankly, the jury is still out. But if we want to engage in wishful thinking, we would hope that they would use these added resources wisely rather than engage again in expenditure that is not sustained.
Let me ask you this then. Moving to non-oil producing countries, which is much of the Levant and many countries in North Africa as well, are we looking at a second Arab Spring, given that there has been a failure over the past decade to deal with the fundamental triggers that led to the Arab uprisings to begin with? And now, as you mentioned earlier, we're in a context of a triple crisis. We have a food crisis, we have a debt crisis, ballooning debts across these regions. There was some discussion yesterday about this in a couple of the other panels. Are we moving? And then there's the energy crisis.
I've always maintained that the Arabs, I call them uprisings. It's a bit early to call them an Arab Spring, but the Arab uprisings are not a one-time affair. In 2018, I remember I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs called The Second Arab Uprising, Awakening, I call it. And I was ridiculed at the time for saying that. People said, oh, we are done with protests. People have learned the hard way that protests don't lead to anything. And suddenly, in 3 or 4 months after I wrote the article, we've seen a second wave of Arab uprisings in Algeria, in Sudan, in this country, and in Iraq. Are we going to see a third wave? In my view, absolutely, and a fourth and a fifth. I cannot predict when it will happen, but I can tell you that with youth unemployment at 30%, with inflation and debt at record highs, with food and energy prices at record highs, this is not a sustainable situation. If countries were doing something about it, something serious, because we're hearing a lot of what I call reform rhetoric, but if countries were doing something serious about it, I would have more hope that we might not witness a third wave. But with the present situation, I cannot see how it can be sustainable.
We talk about education reform, something that you've been heavily involved in for quite a few years. You've written a lot about, and most recently, a report that we just brought out now on the need for education reform. Can you perhaps outline what are the key issues that Arab governments should be focusing on? And why is it so important?
I personally think that education reform should be the #1 priority of all Arab governments. And we are not talking here, of course, of building more schools or even putting computers in them. We are talking about changing the whole mindset of the values and skills that we impart to our children. Arab educational systems have been forever based on rote learning, based on memorization, where no independent thinking is allowed, where truths are always absolute rather than relative, where different points of view are not accepted, etc. That is not a formula for societies to rejuvenate themselves, to become more innovative, to become more productive and deal with the #1 issue of unemployment in the region, because this is a very youthful region. 70% is under 30 years of age. And so we at Carnegie have done a lot of studies on this. But the last report, I think, is important because it does not suffice with admiring the problem. The problem has become known to everybody. I mean, only those who are blind will tell you that we don't have an education problem in the Arab world. So the problem is known, and the reasons for the problem are known. What is not being done is steps to change that situation. And we all know that education reform will take generations. It's not something that can be done over, a year or 5 years or 10 years. What we have done in this report is identify success stories across the Arab world that, of course, are largely done not by governments, but frankly, despite of governments. We have identified success stories of initiatives in Qatar, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and elsewhere in the Arab world. And what we are trying to say is these initiatives might not be applicable everywhere across the Arab world. But these initiatives point to the fact that education reform is possible despite Arab governments, and that they at least provide pockets of hope that we can build on.
Thank you. Last but not least, maybe some reflections on the Middle East program. I mean, the Middle East Center in Beirut is now 16 years old. And Marwan, you've been with Carnegie for 13 years. So overseeing, among other things, both the center and the program in DC. So if you could tell us a little bit in what major and fundamental ways would you say that the Middle East and North Africa region has changed during this period that you've been with the endowment, and how has the program overall, both the center and the DC program, adapted to and developed in order to deal with these changes? Kind of the main themes also that we're focusing on.
I arrived at Carnegie in August of 2010. The Arab uprising started a few months later, not because of me, but
well,
but they
not so sure.
but they started a few months later, and so the early part of the last decade has been spent by us just looking at these uprisings. Frankly, there was more hope that these uprisings would lead, not instantly, but over time, would lead to a more pluralistic and stable Arab world. We've seen examples of this in Tunisia, for example, which offered a lot of hope, and we did a lot of work, and we still are doing work on Tunisia in order to, like I said, transition to more pluralistic societies. Of course, we've had a lot of disappointments in the last decade because the governance issue, which remains, in my view, the center reason why we are not seeing progress is because of the lack of attention to political, economic, and social governance in the region. But since then, we continue, of course, to analyze and to contribute to offering solutions, even when the Middle East is not, does not have the attention it used to have. Because of the failure of these experiments. But since then, we are also faced with other priorities that we are trying now to look at. Climate change has become very central, not just to the economies of the region, but also to the political governance. And the region has ignored this issue for the longest time. No more. And on one hand, I'm glad to say that there is now at least some attention in the region to climate change, and it's an issue that we plan to discuss very closely, not as technical scientists, because we're not, but at the nexus between climate change and governance. And that is something that we, I think we do very well. But the other issue that we are now also looking seriously at is the political economy of the region. The region is going to face short-term as well as long-term challenges. The short-term challenges are what you have talked about. Debt, inflation, unemployment, food and energy prices are at an all-time high. How is the region going to deal with these challenges? Because dealing with them does not involve only economic activities. It has to be linked also to political ones and the need to change the political governance systems in the Arab world. But we're also looking at the long-term challenges because we believe that the oil era in the Arab world is drawing to a close. It does not mean that it is over. But it does mean that Arab governments, Arab countries can no longer rely on oil alone as the main source of economic activity. Oil has introduced a culture of patronage that has really hurt the Arab world. And so we are going to also look at these long-term trends and how to transition from political and economic systems today to more productive ones in the future.
Marwan, thank you very much for a very broad-ranging and in-depth discussion on a number of issues
Thank you.
that face the region. Please join me in thanking Marwan.